Absolutely. Thank you very much. So I'm Terrell Jermaine Starr. I'm a city reporter at The Root, and I will be moderating this conversation with three outstanding experts on the subject. And we are going to be talking about what is next for Afghanistan. As many of you know, the troops finally withdrew from the country. There's a lot of political upheaval that's taking place with the Taliban taking over, but we also have a lot of questions about what the relationship with the United States will be in regards to Afghanistan. And so here to talk to us about that, we'll start off with Basima Al-Hussein, who's the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council. We also have Mohammed Soleiman, scholar at the Middle East Institute, and Silvia Mishra, who is a new tech nuclear officer at the European Leadership Network. Excuse me. So, well, first of all, welcome to the show, everybody. And so I hope everyone's doing well in these very unusual times. So welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having us. Would you like me to start by introducing myself and then going to the other panelists?
Yeah, just briefly talk. Actually, you could talk briefly about yourself, about 20 seconds or so, then we'll get into the questions.
Okay, great. So my name is Basima Al-Hussein. It's wonderful to be with everybody. I am Palestinian American and I am the Executive Director of Middle East Policy Council. I started my career in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill. I later ran congressional affairs for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I went into the Obama administration, was a congressional affairs advisor to the Department of Energy, where I worked with the Office of International Affairs, cybersecurity, and nuclear security. And I am now in my current role. So it's wonderful to be here. Thanks all for having me.
Absolutely. And so, Mohammed, you can go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I'm not sure if I have the same impressive resume like Basima, but I'll try. My name is Mohammed Soleiman. I'm an Egyptian national, a native of Cairo. I graduated with degrees in engineering, but I worked in tech policy and security threats between Cairo, Copenhagen, and Berlin for a few years. Then I moved to DC to pursue my grad degree from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And currently I'm a scholar with the Middle East Institute.
Right on. All right, so Silvia.
Hi, everyone. It's really amazing to be here. And I'm so excited that we are part of the first Diversity in National Security Networks event. My name is Silvia Mishra, and I'm a researcher with the European Leadership Network, where I focus on intersection of emerging technologies and nuclear policy issues. I also work and focus on South Asian security, and especially the nuclear competition amongst China, India, and Pakistan. This event, and especially India's emotional investment in Afghanistan for the last 2 decades, has important repercussions for the region and also for India-US defense and security cooperation, which I have been working on in my role both in New Delhi at the Observer Research Foundation and also during my stint over here in the US for the last 5 years. I'm looking forward to the discussions today.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. So Basima, let's get right to you. What were some of the issues that were part of the collective failure of causing Afghanistan to collapse? Was it the rapid troop withdrawal? Was it the weak Afghan security infrastructure? Failed peace negotiations with the Taliban? Exactly what, in your view, was part of the collapse that we're seeing right now?
Well, I think some of the most important issues was a lack of will on the part of the Afghan people to fight the Taliban, as we saw, unfortunately, their former president, Ashraf Ghani, fled within a few hours. And the Taliban really, truly did not conquer Kabul. We simply did not see the Afghans put up a fight, which was really devastating. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the hearts and minds of many of the people in Afghanistan may not have been fully committed to the cause. And there were a lot of people who benefited from US presence monetarily. As we know, the US poured in over $1 trillion throughout the 20-year presence there. And that created a lot of stable jobs for people in Afghanistan. And that also created an incentive to work with the US that was not necessarily a long-term moral commitment. So we saw, I wouldn't even say necessarily that it was a rapid troop withdrawal, since we have been talking about withdrawing our troops from Afghanistan for multiple administrations at this point, but certainly a weak Afghanistan security infrastructure, I think mainly because of a lack of leadership courageous leadership willing to really put up a fight. As you know, we gave billions of dollars in weapons and training, and so they certainly had the tools necessary to be able to at least attempt to fight back, and we didn't even see that attempt, so that was very disappointing.
All right, Mohammed, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's a very complicated issue. I will start by saying America was in Afghanistan for undefined mission, for undefined timeline. And eventually when you lose your compass and basically your strategic trajectory, you're going to end up with this scene that you have seen in the last few weeks. I was not surprised. Maybe I was surprised by the timeline, but I was not really surprised by the scenes that we have seen. It was very expected. I hate to say that, but in Afghanistan, what Washington tried to do is remaking an entire society on the image of Washington, and eventually we ended up with this. That America leaves, the next day the Afghan army collapses. So that was definitely devastating, and we're going to see how the spillover effect will impact the regional players soon.
Silvia.
The Afghanistan question is definitely a complex one, and as in how we are speaking, it's also an evolving situation. So, of course, debates and theories are rife, but a couple of things which really stand out. First of all, what happens in Afghanistan has reverberations not only just locally in the southern nations for the southern nation security, but also it has global implications. As and how we are seeing the interim Taliban government forming power, it is also important to note the kind of power alignment and structures that are taking place. For example, the Taliban government invited countries like China, Iran, Russia, Pakistan, in terms of their swearing in of their ministers. And we see like countries like India and of course the United States not part of these discussions. So clearly there is a different kind of power structures and realignment of geopolitical powers happening. And second, I think which is important for all of us to note is the kind of credibility and the image that the American power projection is being mirrored for the world. US has several treaty allies, and the fact that the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, and I know that it has been in the talks for a while, but the fact that there has been an unconditional withdrawal really has like repercussions, not just for the security interest of the West, but also other strategic partners like India and other players who have been being a partner and a strategic partner to see and ensure the well-being of the Afghan national government and the Afghanistan people. And then the third is the optics. What really it tells us about like especially like weapons legacy, like issues of global nuclear non-proliferation, and the fact that this is a really this is a region which is suffering and is going to see a kind of power vacuum, and the fact that it also can become quickly a nursery, a global nursery for terrorism and jihadist thoughts can really undermine the West, the interest of the Western powers. So I think some of these issues stands out, and as in how we are carefully being considerate of the situation in Afghanistan. I think even though the United States has exited, but it's really not an exit. In one way or the other, the United States would be involved in like seeing to it that the region does not once again become a nursery of global jihadist philosophies.
Yeah, you touched on something that we haven't heard in the media a lot, which are the regional nuclear security implications. So do you mind expanding on that a little bit to explain what those exactly are or could be?
Yeah, sure. I think that's something that is of concern. And we know recently 68 US policymakers, congressmen and senators have written to President Biden, like flagging that it needs to be ensured that nuclear weapons does not fall in the wrong hands, does not fall in the hands of the Taliban. Now, Afghanistan does not possess nuclear weapons, but in the past, they have expressed their intention to acquire nuclear weapons. And we know that Afghanistan shares almost 1,600 miles of very porous borders with Pakistan, which is a nuclear armed country. There has been several discussions about the safety, security of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal and inventory. Pakistan is also at a time right now is expanding its nuclear weapons inventory and arsenal. It really brings to the fore concerns about the safety and security of nuclear materials. Now, over the past 2 decades, the United States has worked with Pakistan to ensure that Pakistan's nuclear facilities are safe and they're also reliable. But then one cannot really rule out the fact that several Pakistani leaders, and especially in ISI, has been Taliban sympathizers. There's enough literature out there to showcase the really hands and gloves of the Pakistani involvement with the Taliban. The Pakistan has sponsored and provided not only just logistical support, but military aid to the Taliban. So in that kind of situation, it really becomes pertinent for us to understand what really are some of the pain points of the Western powers. And for the last several decades, the United States has been a leading player when it comes to global non-proliferation issues. And it would really like be in the Western powers' interest to see to it that Pakistan has a safe, reliable nuclear facility, so that no kind of technology transfer of nuclear weapons, or even for that matter, nuclear materials, is transferred to the wrong hands.
All right, thank you very much. So Basima and Mohammed, I want you to touch on this. What about China and Russia, the potential of these two major players in Afghanistan? What does that look like? Either of you can, well, I'll start with Mohammed. What are the implications, particularly with China and Russia?
Thanks, Tara. I think there is opportunity and risk here. The opportunity is China and Russia are invested and interested in framing the United States as a superpower in decline. This is the narrative that we see in Russian and Chinese media outlets. However, there's also a risk, which is the spillover effect from the situation in Afghanistan. Russia is afraid that the situation in Afghanistan might lead to spillover effect on the Soviet Central Asian nations, Tajikistan, Dagestan. So this is something that worries policymakers in Moscow. Beijing, similar. They are also afraid that that Afghanistan might turn into a hub for separatist movements that might be trying to destabilize China through Xinjiang. So this is also something that worries the policymakers in Beijing. The two major powers here, China and Russia, are much more in engagement mode, assessment mode, trying to understand what's the trajectory, if Taliban will consolidate power in Afghanistan. And based on that, in my own opinion, they will basically dictate how they're going to engage with the Taliban for the long term.
Absolutely. So Basima.
Well, we've seen that Russia and China have kept their embassies open throughout. And while the Biden administration has so far stated that they do not want to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government, we have already seen other countries in the region, like, for example, the United Arab Emirates, among others, engage with the Taliban and recognize their government. This is very important because if you don't recognize the Taliban as the government, you are essentially creating a non-state actor, which then makes it much more difficult to have any kind of diplomatic solutions or to any sort of conflict. And so we do, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where obviously, we don't want to give the legitimacy to the Taliban, but at the same time, if they're really the people who are in charge on the ground and there are so many issues that still need to be worked out, then we do need to negotiate with them to a certain extent, and we would maintain more leverage over the Taliban if we did. And so as we have heard Secretary of Defense General Austin say, while we have pulled out all of our troops, this does not mark the end of American presence in Afghanistan. It's just changing now from a military operation to a diplomatic and humanitarian mission. And so that is very important. Additionally, China and Russia, building off of Mohammed's previous point, love to paint the US as a power in decline and really capitalized off of the images of the Afghans hanging onto the planes when US troops were leaving and so on and so forth. And so I think it's very important for the legacy of the United States, not just the Biden administration, to ensure that we really do follow through on helping to continue to get American citizens out of Afghanistan, and then our other key allies in the ground who worked with us. And we work with our other allies who still maintain a presence there to get them to safety. So while the execution of the decision certainly was disappointing, and many people can rightly say botched, the decision that President Biden made was a brave decision, and that he recognized that this would essentially be a never-ending war. And so his two options were to either withdraw troops or increase troops, and he made the decision to withdraw. While I think many people would recognize that the execution of that did not have to go so poorly, the way that we can recover from this is if we do, in fact, over the next few months, succeed in following through on our promises. And so that remains to be seen.
Right, but it's an interesting point that you brought up about how Russia and China, China leverages these images of the people hanging from the American planes as they were departing as a symbol of American failure, when back during the waning days of the Soviet Union, the Russians are also run out of Afghanistan as well, so they have their own history of failure. It's just an irony, I would think. Wouldn't it be?
Absolutely, definitely. But of course, in these countries, they predominantly have completely state-controlled media, so they're going to control the narrative about that and just show one side of their perspective. So it doesn't prevent them from essentially really aggressive PR campaigns to, quote unquote, humiliate the United States.
Definitely. So I want to start with you, Mohammed, with a question that everyone else can jump into. I think this is important, about how media are talking about this subject. And I have always been someone that talks about American imperialism and the need for us to reimagine what security looks like. So first, with the media conversations, we all are consumers of media, and we've been watching these images. But Mohammed, starting with you, what are some of the ways in which media are telling the story of what's happening that you have any issues with, and what can be improved?
This is a very tough question. There are many problems here. And number one,
Start off with one.
number one is in my mind the politicization of Afghanistan as a policy. It became part of the partisan warfare in the United States, and it shouldn't be as such. It shouldn't be treated as an issue that's being used to score political points between political opponents. And I think that this is something that I have an issue with. So that's number one. Number two, there's I'm an immigrant. I am an Egyptian by origin and ethnicity, and I still have a problem with the self-projection. The idea we are projecting America and projecting the West on other countries. So more often you basically read pieces in the Atlantic or the New York Times, and it's all about projection, culture, religious projection on Afghanistan. And I'm not saying the issues that these news articles are highlighting are not important. I'm saying that these are not the cornerstone to Afghanistan. This is not the way Afghan people see themselves or see their society. I don't speak on their behalf, but I can recognize this pattern as someone who lived through the Arab Spring, and I have seen the same pattern being used during the Arab Spring. So these are my two big points when it comes to the media narrative surrounding Afghanistan.
Silvia.
I think that is a very interesting question, and I think Mohammed did a really good job responding to that. My sense is that, like, the way the entire withdrawal was executed, of course, it had several problems, but also I do not think that the media was able to really bolster and strengthen arguments of intelligence failure, which were many. And the fact that I'm referring to this report in April 2021 of the National Intelligence Global Threat Assessment, which really underscored the points that Afghanistan would slip into a civil war situation. The Taliban is going to take major controls of major territories, and also the fact that, like, several US weapons and military hardware may be left behind in Afghanistan in the case of a US quick withdrawal. So we had the intelligence, and a lot of, for example, when I speak to people from the strategic policy community in India, they tell me that the Taliban for almost the last 2 and 3 years were collecting taxes in different cities in Afghanistan. So they were already making the inroads. One of the failures, I think, of the media, I think, would be to not be able to showcase properly that we have an intelligence failure at hand, but the fact that there were also intelligence cautioning the United States security establishment of the steps that needs to be taken so as to prepare for not an eventuality like this, like how we are seeing right now, is media's failure as well. Because I think like some of these intelligence that we were receiving should have been made more visible to the American public in general. I'll stop there.
Basima, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think similar to Vietnam, which was the first war that had a really solid media presence with images coming back to the US, because of such a strong media presence on the ground, the US and the entire world really saw these striking images, which, again, there can be a policy debate about whether a withdrawal was appropriate and the timing of that. But what appeared to the world was a quote unquote abandonment. And that is really terrible for the United States image. And so that is why, again, while we have withdrawn our troops completely, I think the only way that we can kind of save face now going forward is that we really do follow through on our diplomatic and humanitarian efforts on the ground there, which will necessitate cooperation with the Taliban, unfortunately. And we do know that, the Taliban now have access to all of the weapons, not all of the weapons, but many of the weapons that were left behind. So they are in a much stronger position than they were before when those weapons were under the Afghan government's control. And then also, I think very importantly, to some of Sylvia's points that she made earlier, the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear state and that we know that there have been, for example, there was a very prominent Pakistani nuclear scientist in the past who was selling information on how to build a nuclear weapon on the black market. So there is a very strong black market for nuclear weapons capabilities. And that can kind of reinforce, again, the need to have some kind of working relationship with the Taliban, because if we don't have any other mechanism to communicate with them or leverage over them than simply just dropping bombs, then we'll be pulled right back in there. And we certainly, I think, don't want to see that happen.
Definitely. I want to touch on the nuclear weapons dynamic because for a lot of people, even those who are in the security community, a lot of us may not be as knowledgeable about nuclear weapons capabilities as some of us. My specific question is, if the Taliban were to seek interest in building a weapon, whether it be a short range, would it be short range or intermediate?
Sorry, they don't really have the infrastructure in order to build a weapon internally, but what they could do is buy their different kinds of nuclear weapons. So there are strategic nuclear weapons, which are the really big ones, and then there are other things called tactical.
Are you referring to big ones as an intercontinental ballistic missile or the?
So the missiles are the delivery systems,
right?
And the head, the warhead, is where you would put either a nuclear capability or you would put a conventional capability. So you have the missile as the delivery system, and then you decide what you attach to it. But Afghanistan doesn't have any of the internal infrastructure to do any of that. However, it certainly does have the ability to buy on the black market weapons that are already made in other parts of the world that would be smaller. So for example, there's like a bunker buster type of weapon or these tactical nuclear weapons, which, relative to our capabilities now, they're small, but they still have the impact and power of that can be greater than what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's very dangerous. And they, could have the capability to use that, essentially detonate it in a city of their choosing, but it wouldn't be via an ICBM. They don't have that capability.
Right.
They won't. I mean, if they don't even have running water everywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. I just wanted to throw that out there so you can explain it. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. So, Mohammed, Sylvia brought up something that was a good point in regards to diplomatic commitments, right? So, even though the troops are out, just maintaining the diplomatic relationships. So, one of the issues that activists have been talking about has been of the rights of women, right, in the civil society in Afghanistan. And so what does a U.S. commitment to issues such as civil society activists and the rights of women, what could that look like?
You are asking tough questions, brother.
Well, I hope.
So there are two things here. I'm a realist. I'm also very skeptical. So when I hear the term U.S. commitments, I'm not sure what kind of leverage Washington right now has over the Taliban, unless we're seeing formal kind of engagement and the United States is willing to recognize Taliban and highly engage with them. And I think that this has political ramifications internally in Washington. So I don't know. Because as also the only game in town is the Indo-Pacific. Once the entire Afghanistani story disappears from mainstream media and discussions here in DC, the next big thing is going to be Taiwan, is going to be Indo-Pacific, is going to be US redeployment or review of US forces redeployment around the world, specifically in the Indo-Pacific. So when you talk to people of the record, it's basically, we need to leave Afghanistan. This is not a place where we should waste our own energy, our own resources. We have other theaters where U.S. interest much more critical for us, for our own national security. So this is my critical, realist answer. But let's assume that Washington is going to commit to Afghanistan or trying to engage or try to have a leverage. I can see this evolving into one or two directions. Either the United States is going to leverage the Taliban needs for international recognition. Taliban needs to get loans or donations or aid from the international community to help with the situation in Afghanistan. Taliban wants to be a state, wants to be a government, wants to be recognized as the ruling government of Afghanistan. And they recognize very well that Washington has the key to that. Washington can leverage that to advance or try to support minorities, maintain or at least maintain some of the gains that Afghan women had for the last 20 years. That might be the way forward, but I'm still skeptical that that can be achieved.
That's fair enough. So Sylvia, what are your thoughts?
With regards to your question about policies on women and also civil society engagement, one of the things that the Taliban is talking about it's a new Taliban. It is adapting to the 21st century politics and governance. There's a lot of skepticism to those claims. I think President Joe Biden is right when he says that it would not be their words, but actions on which their policies would be assessed. However, it is important to see one of the first indicators is that the gross misappropriation and human rights violation that's already happening. The battle or like the infighting that's happening in Panjshir is an indication of the fact that they do want to do away with any kind of opposition in national politics. That is an indicator of that, well, the Taliban 2.0 is not really a new and a reformed body. And then second indicator also, and even though we were not really hopeful on this front, but again, you see that with the new government that's being formed, there is absolutely no women in the cabinet. And some of these are just like indicators which just showcases that even though we can talk as much as we want about a Taliban 2.0, but really we have to understand that it is Afghanistan is under the Taliban rule is going to be the world's most prime ungoverned space. And therefore security analysts and US policymakers would be embroiled in assessing the evolving situation in Afghanistan. And as much as there are discussions about the Indo-Pacific and countering China and balancing China in the Indo-Pacific, I think with the situation in Afghanistan, once again, concerns on India's, and because I'm an Indian national and because the Indian government had an emotional investment and also investment in infrastructure building. India committed to almost 3 billion projects in nation building in Afghanistan. I think I see that India and the United States would do a lot of cooperation and working together on counterterrorism efforts on India's western borders.
No, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up, Sylvia. There's a whole lot of regional diplomacy that that really needs to take place to manage the situation. So, Basima, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'd like to comment first on the issue of women's rights.
Yeah.
For a long time, I thought that we should have trained more female soldiers in the Afghan army because the women, bottom line, have the most skin in the game for an outcome that would be for the Taliban to, if the Taliban lost. So I think they by far had the most incentive and motivation within their core to fight. Whereas a lot of the Muslim men who were on who are part of the troops that we trained, I mean, the reality is their rights were going to be preserved under Taliban for the most part. Whatever government was there, a Muslim man's rights are more protected in terms of a woman's. There's definitely much greater incentive. I do want to say that under the Taliban's rule, prior to the US invasion 20 years ago, one of the things that they did was they prevented male doctors from treating female patients. And what that did was it essentially denied women access to any form of healthcare because there were no women doctors. Because if you can't send women to school, then women can't become doctors. So now that's different. There are women doctors in Afghanistan. There are plenty of educated women. So the Taliban actually does have now a little bit more leeway to, for example, just have completely segregated hospitals and completely segregated schools where it's all female teachers for a female student body. It's all female doctors for female patients. And that was a society that we saw subside in Saudi Arabia up until really just recently under MBS, just a completely segregated men and women society. So there is a difference now in terms of what the internal capabilities of women look like, that I think could still potentially respect or be sensitive to some of the concerns of the Taliban of, women interacting with men who aren't their husband and so on and so forth. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out going forward. And certainly, again, back to the point that both Mohammed and Silvia have reiterated over and over again, we do know that the Taliban do want to be seen legitimately. And if the international community, specifically the regional players, make some of these conditions vocalized of, this would help us to be able to recognize you and work with you if you leave women's schools open, completely women-run hospitals open, so on and so forth. Maybe there's a little bit of leeway there. But Silvia raised a really good point that within the Taliban, there are certain groups that are more willing to embrace change in the future, and then there are certain subgroups that are not at all. And so one of the Taliban's own concerns internally is that if they embrace some of the more progressive elements, that they might lose a big part of their troop base to more extreme terror groups. So like we already saw that ISIS-K is operating in Afghanistan. They're more extreme. So if internal Taliban dynamics, there's a lot at stake there of, are you going to cater to the pressures of the international community so that you gain legitimacy? But then what, are you undermining your own strength internally because you risk pushing out several members of your base to a competing, more extreme terrorist entity?
Right. So Basima, you bring up some good points that I think is vital for media, which is we need to really unpack the diversity of the Taliban, because it's really easy to pass a narrative that just a bullet point narrative that simplifies them and say that all these people have the same mindset about everything, and that there are internal conflicts, and to really understand that it's really to the media's interest and responsibility to really understand and cover the different ways and the different factions inside of this organization and how they're responding to Western pressure.
Right. I mean, you can think about it within our own party, the Democratic Party. We have the more progressive wing, and then we have the more moderate, traditional Democratic wing. And we're always trying to work out those tensions. This is that ramped up by 100 million, and with much more dangerous stakes, essentially.
Yeah, I'm just saying that we understand it here, but I think that there's an othering that American media does in regards to these places. And so you brought up a point that I think ought to be magnified. I want to take the rest of this time that we're talking to discuss American exceptionalism, right? I mean, Mohammed, you touched on the conversation about projection of, the American values, et cetera, and the, basically some downfalls to that. And, we're all a people of color talking about this, talking about foreign policy and talking about security, which is rare. This never happens in our field. Never happens. It's usually a bunch of white men talking about the vast majority of people who are people of color, right? And I know, being a Black man in America who covers domestic politics, particularly with policing, we have our Black Lives Matter movement, our even defunding the police movements, where minorities, people of color, are talking about what security means for them, right? What does that mean for us in America? And so I want to take this time to talk about how should we reimagine what security means? Because we talked, Mohammed, about the ways in which we approach Afghanistan, this whole idea of American exceptionalism, that, hey, we can will ourselves onto these people. I heard Malcolm Nance talk about this numerous times on network cable, talking about, that model simply doesn't work. So how, as we move through this foreign policy world, can we discuss a reimagination of security, and how can that apply to Afghanistan?
This is to me, right?
Yeah, it's to you. Yes.
Fantastic. I think, again, it's an amazing question. Thanks so much for asking it. Reimagining the national security, it starts with recognizing the moment that we're facing in history. The post-Second World War order is not there anymore. This is not the moment. Germany of today is a unified country that's arguably the leader of Europe. Japan is a Western ally.
I'd say they're the leader of Europe, pretty much. Yeah, but go ahead. Yeah.
We can discuss this later.
Yeah.
It's a top U.S. ally. The Cold War that I know only exists in Cold War movies from 1990s. I never lived through the Cold War. So I'm trying to say this moment has ended. The peak of the end of history has ended. Today we're facing a multi-civilizational, multipolar system that's new. It's new to Washington and also new to other international powers, including China. And we recognize that there are some limitations on what Washington can do. Not everything Washington wants will happen. Not everything Washington wants to do can actually be achieved. The whole idea that the end of history means that liberalism should be internationalized, again, I can argue that this is a failed vision, and we're seeing right now ramifications of this. America should not be in the business of changing other societies. So I applaud President Biden for saying this out loud. America should not be in this business. No other country should be in that business. Changing societies is, in my own view, is a colonial behavior that shouldn't be part of the dynamics of international relations as a space.
But most people, Mohammed, I'm sorry, I have to interject. Listen, I agree 1,000%. But there are a lot of our peers, of paler persuasion, on the most part, who would think that we are not a colonial society, that we're not an imperial society.
America is an empire, whether people recognize this or not. America is, in geopolitical terms, in IR terms, America is a superpower with unprecedented influence, military capabilities, historical alliances, hundreds of military bases around the world. America is a country that transformed global politics for the last 50, 70 years. So America is a superpower. That can be interpreted as an empire or not, maybe. I can see why other people say America is not an empire. I understand why. But America is a superpower, and America needs to understand that this is not the status anymore. And based on this recognition, we should start talking about what's our own national security. Because national security for the last 20 years after the end of the Cold War was everything, basically. Everything but kitchen sink. It was Taliban, it was China, it was Indo-Pacific, it was Sahel. it's space, it's everything. Right now, America needs to define a scope of national interest. And we can agree or disagree, it doesn't matter, but we need to have that kind of discussion. Do we care about climate change? Does climate change comes first or great power competition? I don't know. We should discuss that. So that's my answer to your very thought-provoking question.
Yeah, thank you. So Sylvia, what are your thoughts about that?
This is a really thoughtful question, and I think Mohammed gave a very thoughtful and considered response to this question. I don't agree with some parts of what Mohammed said. The idea of how America has changed societies, I think it's up for debate, right? Because like if one speaks to Afghan nationals, the United States has been an enabling power in Afghanistan. For the last 2 decades, the unprecedented progress that the Afghan women registered probably would not have been possible under a Taliban rule. And I'm thinking that it's going to get again rolled back. So the idea that when we are talking about changing societies, we have to kind of really define what changing societies mean. And if it comes for the greater public good, then I think it is important that we rather say that America is an enabling power. I do think that America and its assistance in different parts of the world, which are also some geopolitical hotspot, America's leadership is important and warranted in the region. For example, if you're talking about the Indo-Pacific, Vietnam, even though like we all know about the horrors of the war situation in the 70s in Vietnam, but Vietnam regularly falls back to America's, and demands America's assistance and aid, because even though it has trade relations and economic relations with China, but throughout history, China has invaded Vietnam almost 17 times. So we are seeing the emergence of a new power. The international political system and structure is trying to see how newer powers, and of course the United States had a unipolar moment for a long time, but as Mohammed rightly pointed out, it is a more multipolar, multiplex world order, and the power structures are trying to incorporate newer players in the field. But it is important to know that America's power is not really in decline. I know that this is something that is hotly debated and discussed, but the fact that the United States is going to be an important military player also would have significant consequence and bearing on world politics. And the fact that the US has a huge reservoir of soft power really enables it to play a leading role in different parts of the world, which actually also relies on US protectionism, on US aid and US assistance in several ways. So I would say that as in how we grapple with what does American exceptionalism really mean, or as in how we try to reimagine international security and US's approach to security issues. I know it is going through different changes and is in a flux, but it is also important to understand that like countries are at the end of the day going to work in their own self-interest. And I know that given US's vast network of alliance, strategic partners and allies, they're regularly going to fall back on US support.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. I wish there are so many questions I wanted to ask you about what you said. And I think I'll try to squeeze in a little bit more time before we get to the Q&A. But Seema, Sylvia talked a lot about soft power. One of the things that we are keenly aware of is that the State Department is severely underfunded. And we saw the State Department was particularly gutted under the Trump administration, and there was major demoralization in that department as well. So I say that as somebody who was a Fulbright and somebody who learned Russian and other languages in Eastern Europe through State Department money, right? So there are a number of schools throughout this country, whether they're Russian, East European, Eurasian centers, centers that focus on the Middle East, centers that focus on South America, where the State Department funds graduate students for language study, cultural study, et cetera. And so you can answer the question however you want, but do you mind touching on this idea of soft power and at least making it as important as the military element of how America approaches places like Afghanistan?
Yes, so that really comes down to a lot of the budgetary debates in Congress. And what happens is most of the money consistently goes into the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which funds the Pentagon, and then other departments, like, for example, the State Department or USAID, are looked at, or have an image, I think, in the American public as being more of like charitable organizations, as opposed to being a really necessary part of our national security infrastructure. And so one of the most important things that we have to do domestically is make it clear that the State Department plays an absolutely integral role. I mean, I would always say, you know, during when there were debates on funding the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and people would have those little yellow ribbon stickers on their cars, support our troops, support our troops. I mean, if you're really supporting our troops, you're funding diplomats so that our troops don't even have to go to X, Y place. So that's something that really has to, you know, be expanded. But I think, you know, it's certainly a bigger priority under the Biden administration than it was under the Trump administration. And again, and if we are to go forward, we can take a lot of the money that we were allotting to DOD for operations in Afghanistan and reapply some of that to the State Department and to USAID. And actually, when you speak to many people within the Department of Defense themselves, they'll recognize that a lot of key functions that these other institutions are supposed to work on, what happens is, because they're underfunded and DOD gets all this money, DOD will kind of, in an ad hoc way, try to fulfill some of these humanitarian or diplomatic functions, even though that's not really their main bread and butter, and it shouldn't be, and they don't want it to be, but they see, you know, the implications of the gaps. So yeah, that's certainly a broader debate, but I do want to talk about a different kind of soft power, which is about our cultural influence. And we have, you know, tremendous cultural influence through other mediums now, like social media, and just, you know, how connected we are globally. And there was a really big difference between, I think, when the Bush administration was in power and his embrace of this concept of American exceptionalism. And he really, you know, wanted to spread American ideals of democracy and spread democracy. I think Biden is right in that, you know, that's not really our job. Our job is to preserve our democracy. And I think, honestly, we don't even have to be so forceful in trying to attempt to spread democracy, because democracy is attractive to a lot of people, and they're seeing it, you know, on television. They're seeing women succeeding in sports and in media and becoming presidents of countries, you know, in other places of the world, and wanting to embrace that. And I do agree with Silvia when she talks about, you know, the gains that the women have made in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. I mean, I've been very heartened by seeing groups of women protesting, you know, in full niqab outside of what is now the Taliban headquarters, demanding their rights. And so, you know, of course, life under the Taliban is not going to be how it was when the United States was present with the Afghan government. But at the same time, if the people within Afghanistan now, they've had this taste of a new kind of life, and if they just they refuse to give it up, and so even if they gain maybe 30 or 40% of a better life under the Taliban now than they did under the last rule, that's very substantial and most likely would not have happened without US presence. So I do think we have that potentially to be proud of. And, but I also want to say that I haven't really seen, I personally cannot think of a revolution off the top of my head that was successful when it's initiated by another country. Like, it needs to happen organically from within the population of wherever it is. It has to be done by those people. And then even then, unfortunately, as we've seen many times in the Middle East in particular, you can have a revolution that's successful in the sense that it overturns the status quo government. But then what we've seen so many times is that what follows is worse. It's not better. And so that's really disappointing too. And I think we should learn from this experience that, I don't think that this was worth all of our money and our time and our lost lives and so on and so forth. So, we have lots of things to do at home, and we have lots of other positive things we could do around the world that are less risky and would be welcomed with open arms.
All right, thank you. 2 questions before we get to the Q&A. There is a progressive caucus in Congress right now that's led by Representative Barbara Lee and Senator Bernie Sanders that is pushing for a 10% cut in defense spending. And excuse me, the first attempt failed. And one of the reasons why was that a lot of the people who opposed the cut argued that the specificities weren't in place in regards to which weapon systems would be prioritized and whatnot. And so there are a wide range of other things that weren't prioritized. So but the vote that took place last year was it was the highest number of votes in support of the cut than it ever has been. So there's progress in that regard. And the arguments, and I spoke with all the major people who were supporting this, they were telling me that because of COVID, because of issues such as climate change, it costs relatively less money to prioritize security in that respect, right? Because we've had more than 600,000 people who've died from COVID. There's an argument that, defense spending, and keep in mind that the Pentagon has not passed an audit. A lot of people don't know that. The Pentagon has never passed an audit. Can you believe it? So, but basically, what are your, just 30 seconds or less, what are your opinions about a 10% cut, which is a marginal cut, if you're really honest, we're really being honest about it, a 10% cut, so that those monies can be reallocated to things such as climate change and dealing with health issues such as COVID. And I'll start with you, Mohammed.
I am not an expert on DoD, so I'll try to defer to Basima maybe about this front. When it comes to resources in general, I agree. I think we need a review of the spending in Washington according to real pressing issues in different aspects. And again, back to the other point that we made, it's about redefining our own national security and what deserve more financing and how to allocate that scarce resources that we have. So these are my answers.
Silvia.
I think Basima really pointed out well the fact that there's a lot of homework to be done at home. And I see why this 10% cut would be beneficial towards going through to important issues at home, right? Which requires attention and consideration, like education, COVID and pandemic responses, climate change issues. But saying that, I would also underscore that we are really at a time when the global world order is going through a flux. We are seeing great power competition once again has come back into sharper focus. And if we like it or not, we see that China, Russia are expanding their nuclear weapons arsenal. They're also expanding their conventional weapons inventories. at such a time, I do think that there also needs to be considerations of not just conventional weaponry, but the fact that the United States has, or increasingly is like losing its preeminent position when it comes to being at the helm of cutting edge emerging technologies should be a concern for us. And therefore, I think a reconsideration of like budgetary spending towards like more sophisticated weapons and informational tactics and leverage that the United States can have vis-a-vis its adversaries should be leveraged. And I'm talking about expenditures and defense spending on AI issues, on cyber, and on unmanned systems. I'll stop there.
Basima, you can have the last word on that question.
Great. So this is a very timely question because right now the defense committees in Congress are marking up, which means they're making edits to the National Defense Authorization Act for FY 2022. And they're talking about a lot of these things. They're concerned about China. They're concerned a lot about emerging technologies, AI, so on and so forth. In terms of cutting the budget, I can tell you for lots of different reasons, it's extremely difficult to cut the NDAA. The NDAA is one of few bills that passes every year. And so because of that, people use it as, they would refer to it as a bill that has legs. And so that means
bipartisan support.
Yes, it passes out of committee, it gets floor time, it will always pass. And so there's a lot of incentives to attach things to the defense authorization bill. So what I was going to say, which kind of jumps off of Mohammed's point, is there are a couple ways we could address what you brought up, which is that obviously other things are important than just funding the quote unquote traditional military, like climate change is the national security threat, education, so on and so forth. If we were to redesign the Pentagon and like create an office of climate national security within the Pentagon, I think just based on my understanding of Congress, it would be much easier to get money to climate change, unfortunately, in our status quo system than it is to cut defense spending and create a new office or a new department or give money to a different agency. And this is why we keep seeing the Department of Defense just continue expanding and growing. I'm not saying that this is the right way to do it, but I think this is by far the most likely way to get the money where you want to get the money in our current system. There are billions of dollars put in for lobbying, to get the Defense Authorization Act through. It's super political. As soon as we say, especially like if Democrats are cutting it, the NDAA, then Republicans pounce and say Democrats are weak on national security. There's a lot of domestic political ramifications for it. So I actually think redefining what national security means and then stinking some money or finding a way to get some money for that through the NDAA would be a much more direct and effective way to do it than changing the whole big bureaucratic mess of a system.
Right, I can't go into the Q&A without acknowledging the fact that on Saturday, September 11th, we will commemorate the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, in which thousands of of Americans were killed during the terrorist attacks, and so in 20 seconds or less, I mean, that's a tough ask, but in light of everything that's going on with Afghanistan, what are some lessons that America should learn about itself? What should we as a country, how should America reflect on itself as this 20-year anniversary of this attack is approaching? Barissima, you can go ahead.
Did you say Basima?
But yeah, Basima, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay.
Yes.
Very hard question, but I mean, first of all, I think one of the key takeaways is that invading Afghanistan and then Iraq, kind of on the tails of 9/11/WMD threats, whatever the justification was for getting in there, turned out to be a massive overreaction and led to many more thousands of Americans dead than did the initial 9/11 attacks. So again, but of course, something like that cannot happen on US soil without having a very strong response. So I'm not sure if in the future our response would need to be more targeted or would be have to be more focused on preemption. But again, non-state actors are, I think, by far the most difficult to deal with just by the nature of being a non-state actor.
Got you. Mohammed, try to give it to me in 30 seconds.
I concur with what Basima said. I agree, it's absolutely an overreaction. I understand the desire, I understand the motivations behind the two wars, but I believe right now people in DC across the aisle understand that this was a dire mistake. I hope so. I hope in the future there should be reconsideration, that the nation and policymakers need a moment to breathe before taking a course of action. It's not only 9/11 and then later on war and terror. It's going to be Taiwan, Asia, Indo-Pacific. The chances of an event that can change the strategic thinking in Washington is not that far away. And I hope that 9/11 can be a learning lesson in that sense.
So 3 quick points. Before going into any conflict situation and scenario, I think the United States should actually have a strong and laid out war termination strategy and exit strategy. Second, I think the United States should focus on preventive action, then especially sharpening its intelligence. And then the third is really taking a reassessment of who are its strategic partners and essentially not relying on unhelpful, non-reliable partners, and especially in this case, when it comes to the Middle East and South Asia, taking a reassessment of partners and striking off those partners who have been not helpful. For instance, Pakistan, and striking them off from the designation of theirs as major non-NATO allies. I'll stop there.
Sorry, hey.
I think we lost our host, but that's okay. He'll probably jump back on. Do any of the audience members have questions? If so, feel free to turn your camera on and ask, or you can type it in the chat.
Thank you, Basima. Thank you.
Jeffrey Rice, you have a question? Great. It says, thanks for an interesting panel. Can you comment on how political histories will affect the Taliban's receptiveness of Russian and Chinese engagement efforts? Since Russia and China have two very different histories when it comes to involvement in Afghanistan. And is there any way reluctance on the part of the Taliban to accept engagement from certain states based on their histories, or are they just taking what they can get at this point? Was that clear, you guys, or should I paraphrase? Okay, so Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you, Basima. I think it's an important question. There's no one Taliban. There are multiple factions within the same organization. We have a much more pragmatic faction led by Mullah Baradar, the leader who was responsible for the negotiations with the United States in Doha. And I think his faction is much more pragmatic, is willing to engage. He said multiple times, he visited Beijing himself, he visited Moscow, was willing to overcome previous historical sensitivities based on the 1990s and the experience that Taliban had with other regional powers. And this faction so far is making statements and making commitments and seems to be empowered on the foreign policy front. However, I'm not sure they can maintain the same influence in the future. So this is something that should be in a wait and see mode to assess.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited that we have our fabulous host back, Terrell. So Terrell, we've moved over to audience Q&A. Jeffrey Rice presented the first question, Mohammed answered it, and I'll let you take it from here. You're on mute.
I'm on. Thank you all very much. Electricity went out, even though I had 20% on my laptop. So I don't know, the Russians are probably hacking me right now or something, but it's okay, yes. So now moving on to the next question. Does anyone have a question for our outstanding panelists? You can type it into the chat and then I will ask it. Waiting.
I think I just wanted to take a stab at Jeffrey's really thoughtful and also challenging question, which kind of really provokes a lot of thought and discussion. I think it's also not just about, and like Mohammed rightly pointed out, that it's just not like Taliban can't be viewed as a monolith. There are like different interests and varying interests, but I'm also thinking from the standpoint of China and Russia. I think that even China and Russia needs to go through a kind of assessment in terms of what their policies towards the Taliban and engaging the Taliban should be like. My sense is that to a great extent, like China and Russia's play in the region was also to counter and undermine the US's interest in the region. But I think this new situation kind of necessitates and also puts back kind of reassessment and rethinking also on China and Russia's part in terms of what kind of relationship that they would like to nurture with Taliban. The Taliban recently mentioned about that it is going to be vocal about Muslim rights and repressions across the globe. And the fact that they flagged Kashmir was an interesting issue. But similarly, what is happening with the Uyghurs in China is a concern for not just regionally, but also globally. And the fact that it would be interesting to see like what are some of the commonalities of interest of the Taliban and China and for that matter, even Russia. And like, it would be interesting to see what are some of the convergences and divergences in policy issues in the coming years.
Okay, thank you. But Basima, did you get a chance to answer that question, or did you?
I'm just going to defer to both of their answers. I thought they did a great job. I don't have anything else to add.
You're a very unusual panelist. You know, you deferring. I wish more were like that. Okay. Yeah, that's nice. All right. So, anyone else have a question? You can unmute yourself and ask it. In fact, let me see here. So, if no one has a question, I have one. So,
oh, Jeffrey has a follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey. Yes, Jeffrey. Yes. See what he said. Okay, so here's his question. Here's Jeffrey's question. What is the long-term outlook of the Taliban being able to come to agreement on these important governance questions? Will it be able to overcome the fragmentation you've talked about? So, Basima, you can go ahead. Do you want me to repeat, or do you see it?
I see it. I mean, the honest answer is TBD. We don't know yet. So we're going to have to see, because that tension exists in terms of what I was saying, where on one hand, there's a large incentive to placate some of the international community because they so crave stability. On the other hand, if they do that, they risk losing a significant part of their base. However, if they lose the most extreme part of their base, but they're able to replace it with just general support from the Afghan public because they're in fact embracing a more moderate future, then the Taliban could essentially remain in power. It just has to be willing to let that go. I think that that's the most ideal outcome for the US. It would be great if we saw them, release their most extreme parts of their base to go make their own separate terrorist organization and instead embrace larger parts of the general Afghan public and the international community to have a less extreme government. And I hope that that's what we'll see. I think there is a lot of incentive for that. So, only time will tell.
Right. So, so Sylvia, you can take a stab at this this last question.
I think that was really well answered, as always, by Basima. But the one thing that I kind of wanted to also underscore is the fact that this Taliban has ensured that it does not cut links with Al-Qaeda, really kind of poses a lot of challenges when it comes to the Taliban trying to get a unified kind of and to rally like just not the Afghan people, but also varying sects within the Taliban into a more towards them taking a more unified kind of decision is going to be challenging. A lot of experts have already spoken about the fact that very soon enough, Taliban, like Afghanistan under the Taliban, might descend into chaos and ungovernance and also a civil unrest kind of situation. And it's really, as Basima rightly pointed out, it's to be seen what really follows. But the fact that several different outfits like the ISIS-K is Hydra-headed, and the fact that their ideas and ideologies do not sit well and comfortably with that of the Taliban ideology and agenda really would put a lot of constraints in terms of coming to a more unified decision making and governance in the coming months.
Mohammed, last word.
I believe I defer to the two excellent answers that we just listened to.
Outstanding. Look at you. Number two, deferring. Excellent. We can see more of this on panels. Thank you, brother. So that rounds up our conversation for today. First off, thank you so much to the Diversity and National Security Network for convening this conversation. Again, the fact that we have all people of color doing this is a celebration, and we have to embrace ourselves and to amplify ourselves and our voices. And we know that diversity is just not for show. Our perspectives, our experiences are all vital into, I would say, decolonizing the conversation on national security and foreign policy. So again, I'm Terrell Starr, I'm your moderator, and to Mohammed, Sylvia, and Basima, again, thank you all for taking time out of your very busy schedules to talk about this important subject.
Thank you. Thank you, Terrell, and thank you to my wonderful panelists. I know Sylvia well. Mohammed, let's grab a coffee sometime.
Thank you, Terrell.
I'd like to just chime in and say on behalf of our interim executive director, Robert Alexander, and the DINSN organization, we'd like to thank our esteemed panelists, Basima, Sylvia, and Mohammed, and moderator, Terrell Starr, for the wonderful and enlightening dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, enjoy.
All right, hey, y'all have a good one, all right?
Good evening.
Thank you, Terrell.
Bye-bye.
Yep, thank you.